Hello and welcome to another episode of the Lateral Think Podcast. Today we're joined with Nick Winkelman. Nick, thanks for being with us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So Nick, to give some context to today's conversation, can you introduce who you are and your current role?
Yeah, so my name is Nick Winkelman. I am presently the head of athletic performance and science for the Irish Rugby Football Union. So that's a very fancy title for a person who gets to work across both national and our four provincial teams, helping our coaches support our players across pathway, academy, senior, and inevitably national. And prior to that, I spent about 10 years working for a company called Exos, working across coach education and working with primarily NFL as well as elite military. And somewhere in there, I got a PhD, had a few kids, and wrote a book. But maybe we'll get to that later.
Yeah, actually, it's funny you say that. I met you briefly in 2014 because I was out doing one of the Altus courses. And obviously, when they were based in Phoenix, I think they're back there now. But
yeah,
they came and did some of their work at Exos, and you're actually on part of that coaching apprentice program. And it was quite a pleasure to actually talk to you then. At the time, you were still actually completing your PhD, and I remember a very open, what do they call them, the poolside chat that went down between yourself and Dan Pfaff, where you were talking about external cueing and he started pushing back on you quite hard about wanting to use internal cues with athletes that are a little bit more well-versed in their anatomy and understanding things. And I thought that was a really interesting thing to see play out. So that probably leads us nicely into your PhD thesis, which was on cueing and your consequent, published work. Can you tell our audience a little bit about, what you actually did with your PhD and what it's kind of led to in terms of your understanding of cueing?
Yeah. So I think, right, words are funny things because we all understand them, but we tend to understand them in a manner that is highly unique to ourselves, our culture, and context. So maybe just a few definitions. Firstly, my area of interest, broadly speaking, is diverse, but in regards to this conversation, it's understanding the space between ourselves and our athletes, or the space between ourselves and our patients or our clients, and how we bridge that space. And generally speaking, when we think about bridging that space from a coaching perspective, and here I'll just admit I'm using the word coaching broadly to be a person who is guiding and working with another person, in this case on a physical journey. So not to exclude anybody by using that term. And so when we look at that space, we oftentimes can fill it with activities, tasks, kind of nonverbal things, drills. But then we also know that we fill that space with language, with instruction, with feedback, with guidance. And so for me on my journey, I just became very interested, certainly with the former, but really kind of focused on the latter, because I found that we talk quite a bit, but yet at the time here, I'm thinking back to kind of 2007, 2009, when I really became interested in the topic, there wasn't a whole lot of information about coaching. And what was funny is when you'd ask coaches that I respected, mentors, I'd say, like, how do you get better at coaching? They would kind of give me a funny look. They're like, well, you coach. I'm like, well, how do you learn about coaching better? And they're like, well, read your periodization books, your planning books. I'm like, no. I said, the actual thing that we do when we step in front of a person and open our mouth and say stuff, that's what I mean by coaching. And they're like, well, I don't know. That's just the art. You just got to practice that. And so for me, I wasn't satisfied with that. Maybe as it were, that could have been where things ended, but come to find out it's not. That there's quite a bit of good information and good insight across skill act, across motor learning, psychology, educational psychology, leadership, and the like. And so inevitably, that slowly but surely narrowed me down, because it's a broad space, right, to the moment before the movement. I found that was the most critical. Think about it. If you go on a really awesome holiday or a vacation, it's the best holiday ever, but they lose your luggage on the way home, it's not quite as good. And so why? Well, we have this natural thing where, the last event or the last thing we experience in relation to any given moment tends to have a greater weighting. And so if I give you all this communication, it tends to be the last thing I say. right before you move that is going to have the greatest bearing or weight on how you think while you move and ultimately the outcomes that follow. And for us, this is a long-winded way to get to a definition of a cue. It's that brief phrase you say right before they move to hopefully help them move better. And I've spent a long time now studying that little moment before the movement. And as it turns out, and I'm sure we'll get into this, it is quite critical. And go no farther than a coach or an athlete or a coach remembering when they were an athlete, when they think back to the greatest coaches they've ever had, they probably remember the experience of being with that coach. And it was positive, and the experience also led to them getting better. And I would say, even though they might not have been aware of it at the time, that is in no small part to the way that person communicated and the way that communication made you feel, think, and ultimately move.
Can I ask, what makes you feel and what evidence have you been able to elucidate that demonstrates that the moment right before the task is the pivotal moment?
Well, it's come from this, in that both in myself and in observing others, especially when we're introducing a movement, we tend to have coaches go through a fairly long discourse. We can think of, on the broadest sense at a team level, a coach giving an hour-long team talk, laying out, how many details for the session to come. And now everyone's on the pitch or on the court and expected to apply those, right? So ultimately what we know is this comes down to limitations in attention. If you're driving a car and you're having a chat with somebody and all of a sudden you see brake lights in front of you, what's the first thing you do? You stop talking to the person. And so we have all these different aspects of life that we know we have limited amount of attention that we can deploy and focus on at any one time. And so ultimately, if we give a broad amount of information, even if it's all relevant information, I'm only going to be able to pick certain pieces of that out to focus on at any given moment. And so for me, the moment before the movement, one, it has the proximity. So we have short-term memory primed up. The information's in the waiting room, so to speak. But also, if I make it just one thing, if I make it just one idea, it's very easy to hold on to. And this is why oftentimes I'll associate a cue as like a lens, right? You wouldn't go get a prescription and wear both prescription lenses at the same time. You'd put on one. And the exact same thing holds when we're given a cue. So we want to give that single lens, that single viewpoint with which to approach the movement. And we want to do that ideally right before, such that we don't deal with any risk of memory loss, which happens the farther away I am from hearing the cue and applying the movement. So ultimately, again, a long-winded answer, it's features of our attention being limited and our memory being porous, especially the longer I am away from having to apply what is in that memory. So get it right before and keep it to one thing, and you increase the odds of it, at least being heard and applied. We can then talk about it being effective.
Do you have a good, and I'll give you some context for this, but do you have a good way of quantifying how much change you should expect from good coaching cues versus poor coaching cues? And I say this, and I'm colleagues with a gentleman named that you may know, Dylan Hicks. I don't know if you know Dylan at all. He's
I know my name, yeah.
Yeah, in South Australia. He called me up the other day and we were talking about something he was looking at. And he said to me, like, how much change do you expect when you're working, say, with and someone who's got an injury and they're coming back from that and there's maybe asymmetry with their movement, how much you can coach that? And I said to him, I actually don't have a good way of quantifying that. But I said to him, we're actually talking to Nick Winkelman next week. I might ask him that question. And so I pose that question to you. Do you have a good way of being able to quantify how much change you can see and how can you do that against maybe poor coaching versus, well-structured communication?
Yeah. So the short answer to that is no, right? There's no single way to go about that. But I think we do have mechanisms, both objective and objective, at our disposal that we can deploy to make an attempt at answering those questions. The reality is we can give someone a coaching cue, such as focus on pushing the ground away in a vertical jump. And with the best will in the world, we can never be completely certain how fully a person focused on it. Did they focus on it before the movement and then just jump and, so to speak, let the resonance or the echo of the cue stay within them? Did they actually, at the point right as they're at the bottom, think about and feel the energy of push the ground? We can't know. And even in studies where they ask individuals after the fact, what did you focus on, as a little bit of check for application, or to what degree did you focus on, asking for a rating. Even then, we don't know fully to what degree they applied it and how uniformly. But independent of that, we can start to get a proxy to understand its impact. So, for example, assuming someone was well warmed up, I could have them perform a vertical jump and say, just perform to the best of your ability. This is exactly what happens in the research studies. And then I could have that same person come in and I could tell them, hey, I want you to focus on rapidly extending your knees. Let's say if I wanted to kind of sense check what an internal cue might do for that vertical jump. And then I could say, I want you to focus on rapidly pushing the ground away. And assuming I allowed for enough rest time and there wasn't any residual fatigue, I could, in that moment, do a micro version of what ultimately has been repeated and recycled across the literature. And you might even say, if you had 10 athletes you were doing that on, you'd counterbalance it, where half of them you gave the external cue first and then the internal and vice versa. Because even then, there's the worry that, well, if I give someone an internal cue or an external cue and it works, they like it, might they inadvertently carry that over to the next set or the next repetition, even if I give them something else to think about? And so that's all to say that there are very simple available mechanisms already at our disposal, as we would with any athletic quality, to measure these changes, but we can't always necessarily be 100% certain, and even for the athlete, 100% certain that they focused on the cue fully. All we can do is by proxy say, okay, well, in this instance, we didn't give them a cue and they jumped X height. And in this instance, we gave them the cue and it improved. And if we continue to see that over time, then I think that's pretty good evidence that there likely was an impact from the cue itself. Now, there's a few other things that we have to factor in here. One is going to be, just generally speaking, the experience level and the experience level and level of expertise of the athlete. If you have someone who's highly expert in what they do, then we're likely not to see a significant change in that moment, are we? But it doesn't mean that cue isn't bearing an impact on the way they're approaching the movement and ultimately the impact it might have over days and weeks. Clearly, if I'm dealing with a novice and they're nowhere near their ceiling, especially if a lot of the gains can be driven from a coordination perspective, then one might expect significant changes even over the course of one session with cues, whether it be a vertical jump, broad jump, sprint, bench press, squat, whatever it might be. So those are all the objective means. Take what's already available to you, and then you just run yourself a little bit of a study. It's always good to start with perform to the best of your ability, or let's see how you go once you've given the basic instructions, and then you can apply the cue from there. I think in the reality, a lot of us, when we're out there coaching, we're interested in that, but by way of getting a sense that we're moving in the right direction, we're more actually concerned in the short term with coordination changes. So assuming that you're dealing with a physio or a strength coach or a sport coach that understands the movement and the movement patterns that they're seeking to adjust, then I think that is going to be the best assessment of whether or not the cue is working. You compound that with the feedback from the athlete. How did it feel to you? Did you feel lighter? Did you feel more connected? Were you able to feel association or dissociation in your movement pattern, whatever I'm teaching? That also gives me a second level of evidence. And so for me, in the absence of objective data, did it look different? One, and did it feel different for them? I think put differently, from a bird's eye view, from a third person perspective, did I see a change? And from a first person perspective, did they experience a change? That isn't always aligned, but in my experience, a good cue will generate all three of those. It'll look better, it'll feel better, and measurably, it will be better.
There's a few questions that come out of that, and I think just to give more context again, can you lay the ground for where we are when it comes to the using internal versus external cues, and what
Yeah.
the literature has come to with that, because I've read a diverse sort of different opinions, and as I said earlier, some coaches have different views on it based on things like, as you just mentioned, the experience of the athlete. Can you lay some ground with more knowledge than we have on the current literature and coaching practice?
Yeah, so let's start just by defining these. So we've kind of been poking at them, so we can stick with the vertical jump since we've used that as kind of our mental movement here. So an internal cue, which I usually consider to be a zoomed in cue, is where you're asking someone to move or focus on the action of a single joint or a single muscle or a series of joints or a limb. So, for example, a narrow internal cue, as I like to refer to it for a vertical jump, would be focus on rapidly extending your hips, right? Single joint focus. Equally, if I wanted to broaden that internal cue but keep it internal nonetheless, I could say focus on rapidly extending your legs or driving through your legs. In both cases, I'm drawing attention back to a segment of the body, hence the reason we refer to that cue type as internal. If we then zoom outside of the periphery of the body, then we enter into the opposite here, which is an external cue. And those are the cues like focus on driving or pushing the ground away, which we typically would refer to something as being a close external cue because the ground is right beneath me, or focus on driving or exploding towards the ceiling, let's say. And in that instance, we might refer to that as a far external cue. There's technically a fifth category we can enter into, which I talk quite a bit about, and that's the use of what I would refer to as a figurative, right, a non-literal external cue, or otherwise known as an analogy. And so you might say, I want you to load and explode like a spring. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to import the sense of what a stiff spring might be like and have it be mapped onto the movement pattern. And so if that creates what I refer to as the continuum of cues, the question always is, yes, are certain types of cues better than others? With which populations and under what conditions? If you take the vast majority of the literature that was recently summarized in a number of literature reviews, but most recently in an analysis, it was either December 2022 or 23 when it was published. It reinforced what those of us who are familiar with the literature, and I think what most coaches come to understand in their own right, is that by and large, cues that fall into that external category, whether it be a literal external cue like push the ground away, or an analogy-like version such as load and explode like a spring, those tend to do the following. They tend to result in better measurable performance in the moment. They tend to result in better retention and learning long term, which means that there is a repeated ability to express the change without prompt reminder or feedback in context in some future moment, meaning they literally have retained the movement pattern. This feature seems to be independent of gender, population, and ability. And it seems to showcase itself across a whole diversity of movements, from basic balance activities to strength and power activities to more coordinative activities like tennis, golf, sprinting, agility, and the like. So by taking a fairly strict view of that evidence, you would say you only ever want people to think and use an external cue or an analogy when they're learning to move. Now, unless someone has done some real inspection of all the different ways they use language when they coach, they might find that to be very restrictive and very constraining. And so let me just set it straight here, going back to the poolside chat with Dan. There is a role to play for internal language. I use internal language, but notice here I'm using the phrase internal language, not internal cues. And so here's how I tend to think about it. we need internal language to have dialogue around the body, to have dialogue around biomechanics. If you're a pitcher or a basketball player, I might want to talk about shoulder position or elbow position or wrist position. But in that case, I'm just doing that. I'm talking about it. I'm trying to create a common level of intellectual understanding. But an intellectual understanding is very different than a physical application and embodiment of that understanding. And that's where we start to see space between an internal cue and an external cue. Whereas an internal cue describes what should happen, such as, I want you to flex your hips. I want you to extend your hips. An external cue lends itself to helping you understand how to achieve that. In doing that, I want you to focus on pushing the ground away. And even thinking about the flavor of language that push the ground away versus explode off the ground versus drive the ground away, pivoting between those different verbs, which kind of have the energy, if you would, of the cue, is going to give me a different essence, a different sense. You know, the common way I talk about this in presentations and in the book is, does the word push versus punch feel the same to you? And ultimately, nobody says yes to that. They say they feel different. Exactly. So what an external cue allows you to do is it allows you to connect the biomechanics through the energetic essence of how that biomechanics needs to be brought to life. Taking that a step further, how does that look in practice? Well, I might say to the person, hey, to get a little bit higher on the jump, we need you to extend your hips better. To do that, I want you to focus on rapidly pushing the ground away. And so in that case, it's a partnership between internal, here's what to do, external, here's how to do it. Where I would still probably draw a line, and I can't say I would hold this line forever, but I just haven't seen evidence to the contrary, both in over 20 years of experience now and the literature. Would I ever just say to an athlete, hey, I want you to focus on extend your hips on the next jump? I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't do it because ultimately the hips are not the only thing involved in jumping. You have hips, you have ankles, you have knees, right? You have feet, you have a trunk to control, you have arm action. And ultimately, would you go to a symphony without a conductor? Probably wouldn't be a great one. And so that's what you lose when you get rid of the external cue. You get rid of the centering oneness of thought that treats the body as the symphony that it is. And the key thing with external cues is learning how to target a feature of movement without betraying the totality of the body working together to achieve it. And so when I look at coaching, that's how I draw the distinction. I describe the movement using internal language, as limited as I can, but nonetheless internal language, and I cue it using external language. And I'll leave this answer with one final anecdote. Even if someone fully believed, and there was evidence for which there is not a large body of it, that internal cues were the best. When I tell you to extend your hips, if that doesn't work, and presumably, let's say extending your hips is in fact the thing you need to work on, and I say extend your hips, and that doesn't work for you, you have reached cueing bedrock. You can go no deeper. There is only one set of hips for which you can encourage them to extend. And so even just from a pure practical standpoint, external language and analogical language immediately opens up what I refer to as the language library or the language locker, for which you can find different ways to articulate the same thing to drive understanding. And anyone who's coached for any period of time will know that oftentimes different athletes and different patients need to hear the same message with a slightly different coat of paint, a different color, or in this case, a slightly different reorientation of words or visuals. And so even from a pure practical perspective, you still find yourself coming back to external cues and analogies.
Do you think, you described it a little bit there, but do you think that that's the mechanistic difference for why the external cueing seems to have better effects? You mentioned that wholeness and being able to have the orchestration of movement. Do you think that mechanistically is what's going on? And is there neurophysiology to support that? My lack of understanding in this, but maybe you can speak to that.
Yes. So this falls under the acronym CAH, which is the Constrained Action Hypothesis. And this came out of the work primarily of Gabrielle Wolfe, and subsequently Jared Porter, and there's a lot of other more recent researchers who are extending this. And so the constrained action hypothesis is just that your actions, your degrees of freedom, to use a common term from coordination literature, is constrained. It is somehow limited. And so how do we know this? Yes, there's definitely quite a a bit, in fact, of neurophysiological evidence to support this. So let's take, for example, we just use the lower limb and an example for a calf raise, okay? What the research will do is they'll put them in a fixed, let's say, neutral ankle position against a fixed surface, and they will strap them up with EMG. Okay, and they've done this for other movements, and this is just one example that illustrates them all. And you give two different cues. One cue would be, focus on squeezing your calf muscle or squeezing your glute or your bicep, all the different times we talk about squeezing muscles. That's the internal cue, right? We're applying the definition strictly. The other cue then would be focus on pushing on the platform, right? Pushing the platform away. And what they find is when you give the internal cue, squeeze the calf, equivalently, they could have told them to, extend the ankle. We find that there is a strong co-contractive response. And so you see a high contraction of the calf, but you also see a high contraction of the tibialis anterior, right? So we see a generalized local neuromuscular response. To the contrary, when you tell the person to push the platform away, you see a calming, a near zero response from the tibialis anterior, and you see a strong activation of the calf. Interestingly enough, not to the same response as the internal cue, but you would argue that the calf would have to work a lot harder to fire if it is also dealing with the resistance or the counter forces of the tibialis anterior. And so ultimately what they find is there is contractile efficiency, right? We get antagonistic calming, agonistic activation, ultimately underpinning, hopefully, effective coordination. And so when you start to scale that up from single joint, single muscle research and actions to multi-joint, more complex movements, the same neurophysiology is in play, such that when you give an internal cue, you're giving a general neural signal that not only targets the muscles that you're trying or the joints you're trying to shape and encourage, but also the surrounding musculature. Now, anyone who knows about coordination, one of the first things that we want to see is a freeing of degrees of freedom, whereby we get better synergistic action of antagonist relaxation and agonist activation, and ultimately that crescendos and coordinates in such a way to allow efficiency of movement patterns. So we tend to see quite a objective, measurable reduction in efficiency. And when they start to look at this at a neural level, actually putting people within an fMRI machine, there seems to be on the back of an internal cue more of a generalized neural signature to the area, where the specificity of the neural signature seems to come into play only when you give an external cue, which by its very nature is task-focused, outcome-focused, whereas an internal cue is just generally process-focused. You're not giving the muscle or the joint something to do outside of activate in its own existence. Hence the reason you get a general local response. And so this is where when people start to advocate for internal cues, there are so many layers we can go from the practical and the intuitive all the way right on down to the neurophysiological responses that say internal cues by themselves are likely ineffective and at the very least not sufficient to drive the overall learning process long term.
When you're talking about that coordination and orchestration that occurs by using the external cues, it made me think a little bit about the development of a skill in general and the difference between whole and part practice. How do you integrate that in some of the teaching that you do for, say, an overall skill, rather than maybe just say a physical output like a jump, which obviously has a skill component, but it is a relatively constrained skill set? If in something that's much more coordinated, you mentioned, say, a baseball pitch, what's some of the ideas that you would give to coaches who are trying to extend upon that teaching, especially if it's a inexperienced a child, for instance, who's learning to pitch early on in their development of their baseball pitching, between that difference of part and whole? Because to me, straight away, I think part practice starts to almost shift almost automatically towards internal cueing. And is there
So
any
association.
yeah. Is
Yeah.
there an idea there that you've been able to explore that helps people be able to teach those skills at that level? Or is it very different when you're looking for maximizing an output versus a learning opportunity?
Yeah. So in the most fundamental way, and I don't think this is going to be a controversial statement, you learn ultimately what you practice, right? You get better at what you practice. And so no one, for example, if I can use a basketball example, because I coach my daughter's basketball team, you are not going to be able to teach someone to shoot just by doing single arm activities where you work on basically the follow through with, let's say, a ball against a wall. It's a common activity, right? You have the arm in the shooting position, the elbow is, so to speak, on the shelf, just like the elves on the shelves in my house at present. And we just kind of work on this extension and flick and receiving the ball. And we just go, but the reality is that's not shooting itself. So I don't think anyone for a minute would say, if I just do that activity, all of a sudden now I'm going to be Steph Curry. So the question then becomes, well, if that activity by itself does not make me a better shooter, what is the reason I would do it? And I ask that question.
Yeah.
I ask that question even now with the two of you. And I think I have an answer. The way I look at part-oriented activities, and let me put my S and C hat on for a second. In one way to look at part-oriented activities, especially for complex skills like you're referring to, do I believe that they can actually impose a stimulus that leads to, let's say, a strength or power or physical response? The answer is, without question, yes. And do I believe that, for example, to teach people to be better at agility, doing a lot of shuffling or lateral bounding, might that develop the specific strength qualities associated in that unique pattern of movement? Without question. But is that immediately going to allow me to sidestep someone at full pace on a rugby pitch? By itself, I don't think so. But does that mean that it doesn't play a role? Yes, it does. I would just ask coaches to think critically about what role it plays. So here now, though we're talking, we park that. I think we would agree there's a physical benefit. You have to measure, is the juice worth the squeeze? How much time are you going to spend on that versus more traditional means that we know might be far more effective at upgrading power, strength, and other generalized qualities? Here you're really asking though about coordination. So to what degree is doing part-oriented versus whole-oriented training and its possible association with internal cueing and external cueing, is it beneficial for coordination? It all is a matter of level here. So for example, if I'm teaching football, soccer, which I do with my son, I practice tonight, you could argue that a part-oriented drill is just a shooting drill on the net, right? But that's obviously part in reference to playing the entire game. Same thing, shooting by itself would be part in reference to a whole game activity of playing basketball. I would say in terms of the tactics of a sport, working on the part in terms of working on the skill is absolutely necessary, such that I can start to groove and sharpen and develop that skill in terms of its expression in the tactical, organizational, decision-rich nature of the sport itself. Here, though, we're saying, no, the skill now is the target. And the question is, should I deconstruct that skill even further down into, if you would, the symphony, into the percussion, right? Versus, the flute section and so on and so forth. That's a more interesting question. When and why would I do that? I don't believe I'm going to get significant one-to-one coordination transfer because it's not the same movement. What I do feel, and this is essential, is I can start to create a sensory association with that feature of the movement. I know it's taken us a long time to get there, but I think this is a really important point, such that if I now take my daughter and her teammates and we put the elbow on the shelf and we're just working on extend and flick with that ball bouncing off a wall, I can create an endpoint feeling. And I might associate that feeling with, hey, I want you reaching over the neighbor's fence. I want you reaching over the neighbor's fence on this. Okay. I want you to feel the flow, anything. I want you to release over the rainbow. I can attach an external cue, like an ornament on a tree, if that's what you celebrate. I can attach an external cue to that feeling. And now when I go and actually have the shooting take place in context, I can say, right, finish high, shoot over the fence, give me the rainbow, feel the snap. But I've done that where that was able to take center stage, where the flute section was able to practice and make sure that their house is in order before they play with the rest of the instruments. And so by itself, it will not change coordination in a significant way, but it can create a sensory experience that is easier to retrieve in the context of the whole when I go back into whole practice. And that's where I believe the largest benefit likely comes from, as well as the physical benefit of isolating out a feature of the movement and the physical adaptation that comes as a consequence.
Can I ask a question that might seem weird, but when you're designing, whether it's exercises or you're selecting your structure of your sessions, are you spending significant amounts of time thinking about what external cues or the list of cues that you may have in the bank so that you can pull them out if someone is not necessarily responding to a particular cue?
When I first started, because I think I'd like to think that in the next few decades, if not well beyond that, the knowledge around the space we're talking about here will be as commonplace as program design, right? When I started, it wasn't. There was literally no framework to even think about this. It was just internal, external. And in conversations with the like of Dan Pfaff and others, clearly you saw that it wasn't as black and white as just an internal cue and an external cue. So at that stage, back in the early 2000s, absolutely, I would spend a lot of time. It was a healthy obsession of mine because I didn't find that it came naturally. Like most coaches that come into contact with my work or others like it, they'll say, I totally get it. I actually agree. In fact, most of my experience would say that analogies and external cues are my best cues and certainly the ones that work best for me. But my problem is when they don't work, what do? I'm not very good at coming up with them on their own. And so, by the sheer obvious nature that we are coaches because we know that people need support and practice to get better at things, well, we need to put that mirror on ourselves. And in this case, coaching language and coaching cues is a skill. And it's one for me that I've cultivated now well over a decade. And so, no, I don't need to go into any session and explicitly have them loaded up. Albeit when I was early on, I would build out cueing grids where I would look at the movement pattern. I would break the movement pattern into either its common errors or what otherwise would be put into common phase transitions. So for example, a squat has a two-phase transitions. It has an eccentric phase that then transitions into a concentric phase. Those are the two orienting components, either the downward, right, or the upward side, or how athletes orient. And so I would create cues that map to either the phases of a movement or the common errors. And over time, that skill became embedded and fairly automatic. This is why when I wrote the book, I was very committed to trying to unpack, in hindsight, how I did that, and ultimately what shape became the implicit encoding for me to know how to do this live. And that's where the 3D cueing model came in. It's probably worth mentioning here, where I continued to not create but observe that an external cue or by similar mechanism, an analogy, had three common features. It had the 3D model, sorry, I'm mixing models in my mind here. The 3D model had, if you would, a distance, there it is, a direction, and a description. And those distance, direction, and description mapped onto certain features of language. And so the distance of a cue was, well, am I focusing on something close to me or far away? How do I establish that? It meant that my cue needed a noun. It needed a literal person, place, or thing to orient myself towards. Right? So am I bringing the real world into my cues? So am I pushing the ground away or driving towards the ceiling? Right? So that established my distance. And then my direction, well, am I moving away from the ground? Am I moving toward the ceiling? Am I driving to the finish line? Am I driving through the finish line? These give off different energies. Am I driving into the ground when I'm sprinting or jumping? Am I driving off the ground? Right? One suggesting more of a forceful versus one suggesting more of a reactive. And this ultimately, and I didn't do very well in English when I was younger, but this is a preposition. It's the compass of the cue. Right. So, okay, so now I know where I'm going. Am I going away from this thing? Am I going towards this thing? But how am I doing this? Am I driving a Volkswagen Passat? Am I in an electric vehicle? Am I driving a race car? Am I in a four-wheel Jeep? How am I going to get there? And the description ultimately came to life in the energy of the cue. Well, I'm pushing off the ground. Okay. I'm exploding off the ground. Okay. I'm driving off the ground. Okay. These different verbs gave off different energy sources. These energy sources express themselves in how much tension, how much speed, and how much suppleness, how much lightness, how much heaviness was expressed in the energetics, the sensory experience, the first person experience of doing this thing. And that was played out and is played out in the verb, which quite literally is the action language we use to suggest or point towards movement features. And as a footnote to that, an interesting fact around verbs is when we process verbs, cognitively speaking, they are processed in the same motor cortices that are responsible for bringing the movements to life those verbs point to. So if someone kicks a ball, watches someone kick a ball, hears the word kick, reads the word kick, says the word kick, writes the word kick, in all of those instances, there is shared neural real estate in the motor cortex related to the lower limbs and specifically the component of kicking, whatever it might be. And so that is a literal response to that word. And so we can't forget that words ultimately point to real physical actions and activities in the real world. And so distance, direction, and description. How am I nouning my external cue? What am I anchoring it to? Preposition, where am I moving in relation? And verb, how am I verbalizing the energy and the effort and the nature with which the movement comes to life? And so those 3Ds act as an architecture, a blueprint to help people understand what variables, like a combination lock to tweak, so to speak, to unlock the movement pattern.
What do you see as the balance between the use of direct cueing and the utilization of, say, a constraints-based approach? And how do they intersect and interact? And maybe some of your experience of how you've been able to get them to coordinate to get a good result.
Yeah, absolutely. So by the very nature of a constraint, what is a constraint? A constraint limits one possibility to increase the odds of another movement possibility coming to life, right? So if I reduce the size of the pitch or if I reduce the size of the court, I'm likely going to have more touches on the ball. That means I'm going to have to control the ball much better and I'm going to be more precise in my passing. So by having a small-sided game, it immediately puts pressure on my ability to control the ball, whatever sport it might be, and then skillfully and accurately make a decision. So it puts really good positive pressure on working within the small spaces and ultimately focus on the skill and skill expression that we want. So that's what a constraint is. We also use constraints in strength conditioning and physio. If I have someone's knees coming in all the time, they're clearly not picking up on the sensory signal to keep their knees more in an aligned or a generally aligned manner. And so you throw a mini band on. The mini band on increases the sensory signal, the sense of the knees coming in, constraining the likelihood of it happening, right? We feed the error sensory information such that the person can course correct. So these constraints come in very different forms, from the high level kind of skill expression down to the physical coordinate that we're talking about here with the squat example. In all of these cases, we are utilizing a nonverbal, environmental, physically engageable stimulus to drive a change, okay? That change, though, is suggested to come through an implicit means. It means it is bottom up. I am experiencing something in the environment and I am adapting to it, versus having to intellectually conceptualize something and deploy it, which we would call top down. And so in this case, a lot of research has pointed to the fact that not only are constraints effective when applied correctly in promoting certain coordinative changes or skill expression in a team context, but that it also allows implicit learning to take place, which is a more, so to speak, protected learning, less susceptible to overthinking and pressure and ultimately choking under that pressure. And any coach, again, who's been doing it long enough has seen that an athlete can have a discrepancy at times between how successful they are at expressing a skill by itself or in context in training or in competition, and its ability to equally show up in the same way efficiently in the context of a match. And so this is where implicit learning and heavily constraint-based approaches, which are the driving force of implicit learning, have gotten huge traction within the skill development and coaching areas. However, as I say, that is targeting the perceived. There is still a perceiver, right? We don't, when we deploy the constraint, just shut off the brain. There is still someone who is thinking and processing and trying to intellectually sense make around these activities, whether or not a cue, whether or not a detailed instruction is being given. And so we can't just parse that out. There is always a perceiver and a perceived. And so for me, when I think about constraints, everything is a constraint. Any manipulation to any feature of the environment ultimately is going to encourage one thing over another. And so for me, it's not to say that I'm constraint-led. Every coach, knowingly or not, is constraint-led. Really what we're saying is, are we purposely deploying drills that promote and increase the odds of change in a context that is going to ultimately transfer to a competitive environment if we're working with an athlete? And so I collectively just simply like to call that your nonverbal toolbox. Your nonverbal, implicit, bottom-up toolbox. You're already doing it, whether or not you know it, and so that is a skill to continue to cultivate. The more that can take place in a representative context, the better transfer you're going to get. If someone fails to be successful in a representative context, meaning they're playing a full court basketball game, then what I might do is go, instead of 5v5, go down to 3v3 half court, decrease some of the decision and skill requirement pressure, and allowing you to start to work at the level you're at. That's all kind of operating at that nonverbal constraint, bottom-up environmental lens. But the other side of it, whether or not we engage with it as a coach, it is still in play. There is still a top-down person who is the perceiver, who is sense-making, who is wondering, why isn't the coach talk to me today? I actually don't understand this drill. What am I meant to be doing? Right? And their nerves and their anxiousness possibly getting in the way of the constraint actually doing the heavy lifting and doing what it needs to do. And so over here then on the right, we have the verbal toolbox. And the verbal toolbox has what we've been going through, your selective use of internal cues, external cues, analogies around coaching movement, and the more general communication strategies you use to gain buy-in, to influence, to check in, to drive motivation, right, to show care, to show discipline as needed. In our context today, cues are the equivalent to constraints. They are mental constraints. They are encouraging you to point this attentional spotlight at this over that, here over there. So when cues are used effectively, for me, they are operating through ultimately a very similar mechanism as a physical constraint is. It's just a different way to approach it. Rather than bottom up, I'm going top down. And at the end of the day, you're never going to have a session where you are completely silent. There's a model that has been promoted by Keith Davids around this idea of a hands-off coaching model. And again, I agree. Let the drill do the talking and the athlete do the walking all day long. But show me an athlete that gets infinitely better by just doing the same drill over and over again without any input, support, or comment from the coach. It just doesn't happen. Inevitably, there is a plateau. And at that point, I'm trying to help the athlete improve their sense making and say, well, okay, on this next drill, if you're trying to get around this defender, right, I want you to actually focus all of your attention. Imagine they're wearing a big Texas belt buckle. I want you to keep your vision right there on that belt buckle the entire time and read and respond to their body movement from there, right? So there is an external cue that helps someone who's not effectively scanning an open field one-on-one decision making. And rather than them focusing on anything, I draw their attention to the right thing. It's still constraint-based, it's still responding, but now I'm skillfully helping the perceiver and the perceived come into better harmony quicker. And so you let the drill run as long as you can. I agree with that. Let them extract what they can from it of their own accord. Brilliant. But inevitably, to chip away at it, I still think an external cue, an analogy needs to come into play in partnership with the constraint. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yes. I do. Yes. So ultimately, what this requires is the ability to discern and recognize when you have reached, I'll use the word again because I like it in this context, learning bedrock. Okay, so in that moment, you are coming up against something and we're not seeing any additional progress. So you can imagine, interestingly enough, why would an expert coach let things play on possibly longer than a more novice coach? Well, they might be able to pick up on more subtle nuance in movement changes that the novice coach is not able to pick up on. The novice coach is still just seeing the big rocks, whereas the expert coach can see the little pebbles and the sand between them all. And so the granularity of a coaching eye is likely going to impact how they're going to approach this, and thus the answer that one can give to this question. The way I like to think of it is this. Again, whether or not you had kids, you've probably seen little kids when they go over and they find a light switch, especially the ones that kind of jut out of the wall. It's literally a switch. They'll take them and they like to flick them, right? And we literally say flip or flick the switch. And they'll and a parent like, stop that. You're going to short circuit the lights. Actually, I think that is a useful metaphor for what we're looking for. I've watched someone move and they express some kind of a movement signature. We perceive this movement signature. Let's say it's sprinting. They have a very circular type action in their acceleration versus kind of this more linear piston-like action in the first 3 to 5 steps, if we use that as an example. And so we want the straight line acceleration, but now we have the circular acceleration. And to use a term that doesn't come from him, but was popularized by Franz Bosch, is they're currently, let's just say they're in the circular attractor state. They are in kind of this pull and grasp cyclical attractor state. They're stuck, if you would, in this well of movement. They keep defaulting, I'm using different ways to say the same thing, back to the same organizational pattern. So you have to do something to bump them out of that pattern. And so maybe in this case, you give them a constraint. You put wickets or hurdles in front of them, and you put them at cascading distances, which require you to push back more to cover said distance, increasing the odds of a more flexion, extension, linear running. There's a nonverbal constraint-based approach. But let's say you're doing it and they are all over the shop. They can't get over the fact that there's a hurdle on the ground. They keep staring at it. Now they're rounded in posture. Okay. Anyone who's done sprint training knows that not all constraints work equally for all people, even of controlled ability. And so you're like, okay, I'm going to have to use a cueing. I'm going to have to use a verbal approach here. And so now I give them a cue. And let's say the cue is, hey, I want you to focus on pushing the ground back. Or equally, it might be, I want you to focus on driving your knee forward as if to shatter a pane of glass. Either way, my cues are on the edges, right? The linear edges, the phase transition moments of that running movement pattern. And so here I'm trying to promote a different attractor state. I'm trying to get them, literally think of the word, for those unfamiliar, attracted quite literally to a different form of movement. We want this other form of movement to be more attractive, more interesting, sensorially, right? Gravitational to them. Get them out of the orbit they're in into a different orbit. And so what I would want to see is the pattern appear to be flickering, literally, where it might be the first two steps now are really big and bold, but then they go back into the cyclical action too early. Or I might see literally the left side of their body explodes, beautiful long, and then they step over as if there literally is an invisible hurdle in front of them with the right leg. So it's like the left leg got it, but the right leg didn't. For me, this is the flickering of the light, the pattern turning on and off, flipping from one attractor to the other. And I don't think that this is an unfair representation of what the educated coaching eye literally sees live. And so as long as I see the flickering, guess what? I'm going to stick with the cue, or I'm going to stick with the constraint. What I might start to do is play around with the cue itself. And so let's say the cue pushed the ground away, I got a bit of purchase on it, it worked, but I wasn't quite getting enough push. I might say, okay, which word to you feels like it has more energy, push or drive? And they might be like, drive. I said, okay, so on this next one, I want you to really focus on driving the ground away. But you see what I did there? I didn't just say, hey, drive the ground away, right? All of a sudden flipping it on them. I actually involved them a little bit in the conversation. I said, which one feels more energy? So I'm already signaling to them that this word, by their own admission, but now by their own recognition, gives more energy. And that immediately primes the cue to work better than had I just thrown it out there randomly as background noise. So to summarize then, I find the cue, I look for the flicker, or the light just turns on. Great, that happens as well sometimes. Every coach has experienced that, where the penny drops, right? And it's like, aha, I get it. But in the absence of that, which isn't always going to be the case, especially if you're working with someone more experienced and elite, I'm looking for the flicker. And as long as I get the flicker, I'm going to stick with the cue or the direction or the energy of the cue. We're going to play around in that sandbox until which time things flatline, we lose energy, we lose interest, and then we'll start to pivot. How long that takes, it is anyone's guess. It might be a few repetitions. You might be able to ride that out for a few weeks, but it's a dance. And you just got to keep listening to the music, which is the athlete, and making sure you're staying in time with them. Mm. Mm. Yes. It's a great question. I actually, for those that want a literal way to engage with the answer I'm about to give, I posted slides on my LinkedIn account just a few weeks ago based on a presentation I did a few years back in the States called Zen in the Art of Coaching. And so you can't see it now, but my left arm, to my mom's dismay, I never thought I'd get a tattoo, and now here I am walking around with an entire left arm sleeve of a tattoo. But the tattoo is in recognition to Eastern wisdom traditions. So, covering the like of Zen Buddhism primarily, but pointing to Taoism as well, and the Indian roots from a Zen perspective. this has been an area of philosophical inquiry for me that personally has been tremendously important. But for those that have spent any amount of time thinking about and trying to wrap their mind around Zen, which that in itself, for those that are familiar with the topic, is a very difficult and almost ironic thing to say, because Zen is that which can be felt but not grasped or verbalized, has actually made its way to impacting my coaching as well, and that I'm constantly fascinated with how I can help an athlete create greater oneness and connection with not only their body, but with their body and the world around them. And ultimately, the space between the body and the world is expressed through how we move in it and through it. And so one specific author that I think is very good at translating this into, so to speak, Western sensibilities, who has long since passed, is a person named Alan Watts, who has a wonderful book called, ironically, The Wisdom of Insecurity. And that, in fact, is a beautiful title to capture the essence of what Zen and Zen Buddhism is. And so I think what's very important, it's a common misinterpretation, but Zen Buddhism is oftentimes be called the religion of no religion. And so independent of someone's spiritual beliefs, I don't think they will actually find the pursuit and the inquiry into Buddhism generally, and Zen Buddhism specifically, to sit in any contrary or counterproductive way to their own thoughts. It's more of a philosophical discourse around how to ultimately become utterly and inextricably connected to the world around you. And I think that is both personally beneficial, but in the case of teaching people to move, it's on benefit there for me as well. I can't, to be honest with you, outside of giving that presentation, which was a very personal thing for me to do, because I had come into the topic for personal interests and reasons, not necessarily knowing how much it would impact my thinking, and in fact echo a lot of my existing thinking, but just through a different lens. I haven't presented it a lot, but it's something that I sense that I will talk about it more, if not directly. I certainly talk about it indirectly, and how it's benefited me. And so I never take an approach where, hey, this will benefit you, but rather showcasing how this has benefited me personally and professionally. And through that lens, if someone finds a doorway to step in, I try to give them some resources to help them along their way. Now, listen, thank you both. Very thoughtful questions. I appreciate it.